The world remembers a single image, a silver giant draped in flame, collapsing toward a muddy field as people on the ground looked up in horror. But what if that image was only the beginning of the story? What if, decades later, a survivor's whispered confession at the end of his life peeled back a different layer, one that points to secret passengers, warning letters, and a cover-up that stretches far beyond a single crash? This is the story of the LZ-129 Hindenburg, the pride of an era, a floating palace built on fragile gas, and a disaster whose smoke still hides questions. Listen closely, because what follows mixes engineering, human courage, and an allegation that changes what we thought we knew about that terrible evening. They called it a floating palace for a reason. When the Hindenburg finally slipped out of its hangar in Friedrichshafen in March 1936, people stepped back as if the air itself had been rearranged. At roughly 245 meters long, nearly the length of the Titanic, and with a diameter that made ordinary aircraft seem toy-small, it wasn't just big. It was otherworldly. Inside a skeleton of duralumin were 16 enormous gas bags holding almost 200,000 cubic meters of lifting gas, enough to make the Hindenburg soar like a sleeping leviathan. The plan had been sensible and simple: use helium. It didn't burn. It lifted less than hydrogen, true, but safety mattered. The problem was geopolitical. The United States, the primary source of industrial helium at the time, had tightened export controls after World War I. To the German engineers and politicians who watched the world edge toward another war, the Helium Act looked like an impenetrable wall. No helium for Germany. No exceptions. So the Hindenburg's designers used hydrogen instead. Hydrogen was lighter, cheaper, and abundantly available, and it was famously flammable. The choice hung above the ship like a quiet threat. The Hindenburg was gorgeous and luxurious: 2 whole decks arranged for passengers, private cabins, a grand dining room, a lounge, even a pressurized smoking room with special safety features designed to keep embers from wandering out. The headlines called it a triumph of engineering. The passengers called it the only way to cross the ocean and look down on the world as if it were a map. For a while, the dream held. The Hindenburg crossed the Atlantic in record time. It carried people, mail, newspaper reporters, dreamers, and military observers. On routine flights the ship seemed perfectly safe, thousands of people traveled without serious incident, and 1,000,000 miles were flown. But underneath the pomp and the cocktails was the quiet knowledge that one small shock or a stray spark could turn beauty into blast. Before its final voyage, the Hindenburg's history was already threaded with warnings. Hugo Eckener, the legendary figure of the Zeppelin company, had pressed for helium, understanding that hydrogen's benefit came with a terrible cost. Other experienced men voiced the same quiet worry. A single stray static discharge in the wrong place could be catastrophic. In private, some of the ship's champions admitted that hydrogen made the Hindenburg brittle in a way that skill and careful maintenance could never entirely remove. Still, in early May 1937, the ship prepared for another season and another North American crossing. Captain Max Pruss took command. Ernst Lehmann, another senior figure in the Zeppelin world, would travel as well. Men who had flown airships for decades compared notes, checked logs, and worked the schedule. A few weeks before departure, a curious and chilling piece of paper arrived, an anonymous letter from Milwaukee, warning that a bomb would destroy the airship on one of its flights. The captain tucked the folded note into his pocket and, like many who receive impossible warnings, decided to carry on. There were other oddities too. Military officers and observers sometimes sailed as passengers to study operations. On that trip there were 3 Luftwaffe officers listed as passengers. They claimed civilian status and said their purpose was technical. Later, those same presences would fuel rumor and suspicion. Who were they really? What were they doing aboard? The official record would call them observers. Decades later, some accounts, and some hushed whispers, would suggest something more complicated. For now, the ship rose from Frankfurt on May 3, 1937, with people full of everyday hopes: a 14-year-old cabin boy hoping to prove himself, a bartender polishing the brass, a journalist with a tape recorder, families bound for America. The crossing was uneventful and even stately. Passengers leaned at the long gallery windows and pointed down at city grills, the rivers like veins, the cloud tops like islands. On May 6, the Hindenburg looped lazily above Manhattan and then set a course for Lakehurst, New Jersey. The ship was making good time, trying to make up for delays. Then the weather closed in. A line of spring thunderstorms had swept through the area. Gusts bruised the air and thunder still muttered in the distance. For a time the captain kept the ship looping off the coast, riding the winds and hoping the weather would clear. At dusk on May 6 the report came from the ground: it was safe to land. The crew prepared for what the Americans called a fly-in landing, lowering heavy mooring lines from several hundred feet so ground crews could snatch them and winch the ship down. The maneuvers were routine in theory. But routine, in a vessel filled with hydrogen and sensitive to weather, is never quite routine. As the Hindenburg descended toward Lakehurst, a tiny sequence of events set the stage for disaster. Engines slowed. Men in the control car watched instruments and spoke in clipped terms. On the stern a single mooring line caught harder than the rest and the ship shivered. A fluttering along the dorsal surface, witnesses later described the skin rippling, and then a faint blur of bluish light, perhaps static from the charged storm air. A muffled pop, then a flash. Flame, sudden and savage, erupted along the top near the tail. To people on the ground it looked like a flower blooming in fire along the back of the Silver City. What happened after is both simple and impossible to fathom. Hydrogen burned. The fire leapt from cell to cell, gorged itself on oxygen, and chewed through the duralumin skeleton. Within seconds the tail was a furnace, molten metal and fabric fragments fell like confetti. The stern lost lift and collapsed, while the bow, still full of unignited gas, pitched upward. The whole airship knifed toward the earth at a terrifying angle. Radio journalist Herbert Morrison, who had been reporting the landing in his calm, practiced voice, heard the first screams, and then everything in his world broke. On his recording, played the next day and replayed for decades, his voice cracked as he watched a silver mass fold into fire. "Oh, the humanity," he cried, words that would echo through generations. But while the phrase became shorthand for disaster, the real drama belonged to the people fighting to live inside the ship's belly. Survival came down to a handful of brutal, random facts: where you stood when the first flash appeared, how fast you could reach an outer window, whether a hatch stuck, whether a rope snagged your ankle. 9 crewmen at the bow, those handling mooring lines, had little chance as the inferno lunged forward, turning the catwalk into a blowtorch and blasting out the nose like a volcanic throat. Some died instantly, others jumped only to fall and meet the ground in a different kind of violence. And yet, from that molten wreckage crawled survivors. Out of 97 souls on board, 62 walked away from the field. It was a terrible math: 36 dead and the rest limping, burned, or shocked. On the ground a naval crewman was killed by falling debris. Firefighters and medics rushed into an impossible scene to pull people from the smoldering shell. Among the survivors was a boy who would come to embody the improbable, Werner Franz, a 14-year-old cabin boy who later said his first words after the crash were as simple as they were miraculous: wet, but alive. Earlier that evening he had been stocking dishes in the officers' mess when he heard a thud and the plates shattered. He saw the stern rise and felt a wall of heat roaring forward. He clung to a rope as the ship twisted, and then fate itself intervened. A ballast tank above him ripped free and a waterfall of hundreds of gallons crashed down, soaking him and shielding his clothes from the worst of the heat. That instantaneous deluge, a freak physics rescue, bought him the seconds he needed to kick open a small provisioning hatch and leap onto the ground below. He sprinted upwind and crawled free from under the burning hull. Many years later he would show reporters a charred pocket watch and a bent piece of frame, trophies of escape. Elsewhere on the ship people made impossible choices. A steward smashed windows and urged passengers to jump. Circus acrobats who could flip through a hoop used those same instincts to leap from the sky. Families tried to hold together and were torn apart by the angle of fall and the intensity of the blaze. Some people who had stepped out moments before the landing never returned. Bartenders polishing glasses were trapped behind smoke. Riggers and radio operators kept sending messages until the heat overtook them. The scene was a collage of small heroics and small tragedies, stitched together in the harshest of seams. In the immediate days that followed, the world asked a question that felt both simple and impossible: how could this have happened? At hearings, in interviews, in the wardrooms of hospitals, survivors and investigators recited possibilities. A static discharge? A hydrogen leak? Structural failure? Or something more sinister, a bomb? Captain Ernst Lehmann, himself badly burned and suffering from inhalation, would later say, in quiet, tortured moments, that the destruction felt like an act of sabotage. He used a German term that translates roughly to infernal machine. To him, the sudden, instantaneous nature of the blast suggested outside intervention. He urged that the next airship should have helium, not hydrogen. But not all survivors agreed. Werner Franz, major witnesses, and many others testified that they saw no sign of a bomb, no trace of a deliberate incendiary device. For them the fire came from within, an unfortunate conjunction of weather and static, a leak and then flame. The United States Commerce Department mounted an inquiry. It would list technical failures and port security lapses and stopped short of declaring a bomb had been placed aboard. And yet, like a slow ember that refuses to die, suspicion remained. Years later, decades even, rumors would harden into allegations. Some claimed that secret agents had been on board, that some passengers were not who they claimed. The story that opened this film, that the last survivor of that flight died in 2014 after making a deathbed confession, feeds that ember. According to the claim, the survivor signed documents and stayed silent for 77 years, then finally, at the end, said something that appended the simple narratives, that there had been secret passengers, that sabotage was planned, that a cover-up stretched to high places. Whether that allegation is true in full, in part, or not at all is itself a question, a curiosity loop that many accounts never fully close. What matters for our telling is this: the Hindenburg disaster did not end with flames. It sparked a lifetime of conflicting memories, partial truths, and the sorts of human decisions that are hard to reconcile.